Harriet Jacobs was born into slavery in Edenton, North Carolina in 1813 to Elijah Knox and Delilah Horniblow. When her parents died, she was sent to live with her mistress at a young age and was then taught how to read and write. When her mistress died, she was left to live with a master who sexually abused her and another mistress who hated her. In her late teens, she had an affair with a white man, with whom she had 2 children, Joseph and Louisa, known as Ben and Ellen in her narrative. After, while she was still young, she managed to run away from her master. She hid in her grandmother's attic for years before finally escaping to the north, where she later reunited with her children. Amy Post, an abolitionist and feminist, encouraged Jacobs to write about her life. With the help of black abolitionist writer William C. Nell and white abolitionist woman L. Maria Child, Jacobs published her narrative in 1861 under the pen name Linda Brent. As the national crisis deepened, Jacobs attempted to swell sentiment for emancipation by publicizing and circulating her book.
In Jacobs' writing, she acknowledges her and other slaves' lack of protection under the law by showing that the only true protection she ever had was that of other white males, as she realizes that she has no true legal protection due to her undefined status as a person. As for her lack of protection from sexual assault, she shows this by explaining how she tried to obtain protection from her master, Dr. Flint, from the father of her child, Mr. Sands. As for thievery, she had to call upon a white male friend to protect her from poor white looters seeking to ravage her grandmother's home during the aftermath of the Nat Turner Rebellion.
Saidiya Hartman, the author of Seduction and the Ruses of Power, provides information that gives insight into the extent of slaves' protection under the law in the United States in the 1850s. Since slaves were considered property in the eyes of the federal government, federal law did not apply to them. However, since they were to some degree still considered people, they had statutory laws, known as slave codes, that provided them with minimal protection under the law. However, not included in statutory laws were the illegality of rape and sexual assault of slave women, an issue that constantly affected Jacobs in the form of her master, Mr. Flint. In her writing, Hartman explains how the lack of protection against sexual assault of slave women was a result of a lack of recognition of the rights of both slaves and women and their legitimacy as people. Issues such as consent and will were unsolvable, as both of these terms imply that a person has power over their body and their actions, and has the right to express this power of self, which directly rivals the basis of slavery, that slaves are property. Hartman states that slavery took away a person's will, rendering them willless and always willing, because slaves are legally unable to give consent or offer resistance. To act outside the scope of willful submission was to defy the law.
Since Jacobs was not protected under the law due to her illegitimacy as a person, she found legal protection in white men, as they were the only ones who actually had any power to protect her from the crimes done against her. The first crime is that done to her by Dr. Flint, who continuously sexually assaults her. The beliefs and practices in the South were that a raped slave was neither a person under criminal law nor property protected by civil law. The only way she can see herself escaping this crime is to enter into an affair. Mr. Sands, a white man who would have the legal power and ability to remove her from this upsetting relationship with Mr. Flint. Any other attempt to stop this injustice would have proved to be inadequate, as Jacobs had no legal legitimacy to press charges against Dr. Flint. The only protection she would be able to find would be the protection of a white man, in this case, Mr. Sands.
Another crime that Jacobs is not protected from is thievery. During Nat Turner's rebellion, a militia came into her grandmother's house to search for any links to Nat Turner, a slave who started a revolt in Virginia that killed 70 slaves and 55 whites. When they came into her grandmother's house, they came in aggressively and were hovering over her silver and her linens. Jacobs, seeing that the situation was going to take a turn for the worst, called out to a white man on the street who was a friend of her family and asked him to stay until the search was over. She knew that if the poor white man had taken anything of her grandmother's or had hurt either of them in any way, the only person who would be able to report the crimes with legitimacy would be a white man.
In addition to Jacob's struggles to establish herself as a real person in the eyes of the law and society, she also struggles to establish herself and her writing as truthful, similarly to how Crevecoeur struggled to establish himself as a legitimate American. She addresses the potential criticism of lack of truthfulness and legitimacy in the preface of her autobiography. She writes, "Reader, be assured this narrative is no fiction. I am aware that some of my adventures may seem incredible, but they are, nevertheless, strictly true. I have not exaggerated the wrongs inflicted by slavery. On the contrary, my descriptions fall far short of the facts.